privilege for me to stand here on such a momentous occasion and have in our midst some really amazing folks. Of course, the Historical Society is an integral and very valued partner for Pittsfield Township. We couldn't do events like this and the number of preservation programs that are going on throughout the township without your cooperation, assistance, and leadership. So thank you so much to each one of you that are serving on that society. I want to also recognize two of my predecessors, Mr. Jack Morris and Mr. Doug Woolley, previous supervisors here at Pittsfield Township, that are now engaged very actively with the Historical Society. It is that sort of work and continuity that has made Pittsfield Township such a desirable place to live, work, and recreate. So thank you all for what you do on a daily basis to make Pittsfield Township what it is today. With that, I want to welcome you all officially to our 200th commemoration of the 1850. I'm not used to saying that. 1850, wow, that was a long time ago. 1850 Michigan survey, during which our 4 township boundaries were established. I especially would like for you to join us following this program, and we're going to go right behind us to Prairie Park. It's directly south of this building, where we will place and inscribe a witness tree. And the purpose of this is really to leave behind something that is a visual and physical depiction of our historical, cultural heritage, and something that will give folks into the future generations and our posterity a time to step back and take a moment to value where we've all come from. So I hope that you'll join us for that very amazing event. And of course, I would be remiss if I didn't recognize Mr. and Mrs. Wall, that have spent a lot of time, especially in the last 6 months or so, putting this whole event together and having some really distinguished guests that are here, and I'm sure Mr. Wall will talk about them a little bit more, that are going to speak to more specifics about highlighting our historical heritage, how the surveys were done, and the amount of work that it took. I just have a little glimpse of it from the little piece that we wrote in the Pittsfield Post. So thank you to you all for being here, taking time this beautiful fall Sunday to join us in commemorating this amazing event. And with that, I'm going to turn it to you, Mr. Wall, to lead us in the program for this afternoon. Thank you all.
Before I start, there's going to be a number of maps that have some considerable detail. And if anybody can move up here, I think there's one extra seat here. You might be able to see the maps a little bit more clearly. I want to thank Mandy and a number of her very talented staff members, Jessica West, Trish Riley, Craig Lyons, and Alan Squire, for all the things they did that will contribute to this particular event. I also want to thank Mary Ellen, my wife, for all the time and effort she's put into making this program possible. Today we're joined by 2 very distinguished professional surveyors and survey historians. Jack Owens comes all the way down from Roscommon, Michigan to join us today, and Gill Bonno comes from Fenton to join us. Jack has had about 50 years of professional surveying experience. 11 of those were actually spent here in Washtenaw County, during which time he was able to discover and to reestablish, I think, something like 4,000 monuments, and that included some of the original corner posts that were set in 1815, 1819 in that time frame. Jack also holds licenses in 6 western states, and he has spent a lot of time there. And he has also surveyed for a year in Iran. Jack has served the Michigan Society of Professional Surveyors for many years in many capacities, and likewise he has served as a trustee for many years on the Michigan Society of Professional Surveyors Foundation. Jack currently, Governor Snyder has currently appointed Jack to a state commission on surveying remonumentation, and Jack was instrumental in urging the commission to study and to restate the Indiana-Michigan boundary. Gil has 44 years of surveying experience. He joined the Michigan Society of Professional Surveyors in 1971. Excuse me. Allergies and asthma. Gil has served the society as director for 6 years, and this year he was recognized by the society as the member of the year and was given life membership. And in addition, like Jack, he has served for over 25 years or so on the foundation, and he served as president of the foundation for 3 years. Both Jack and Gil were very involved in the establishment of the Museum of Michigan Survey and other educational and outreach activities. And I feel very fortunate that they're going to be here to make presentations this afternoon. But since most of us here are not professional surveyors, I wanted to take a few moments to introduce some definitions and concepts, and then to provide the background to the onset of the actual surveying process itself. Jessica is going to help me with some slides here. So first slide of Michigan. What's there? I apologize, I'm legally blind, so this is a good demonstration of that. This is a current map of Michigan, and you can see there's a grid, east-west and north-south lines at right angles to each other that crisscross the entire state. That happens to be the rectangular survey system. And each of those little, what are they, blue squares or so, represents a 6 mile by 6 mile square township. Now, Michigan has about 1,400 townships, and every single township has a unique identifying number. And the numbers indicate their location with respect to certain key reference lines. The dark line, north-south dark line, is the Michigan Meridian, and the east-west dark line is the Michigan baseline. And many of you certainly know the baseline road, or 8 Mile Road, which are the same. The meridian itself follows 127 from the Ohio-Michigan border up toward Lansing. Now, to construct the identifying numbers, there's an east-west reference number and a north-south reference number. And so the east-west, the horizontal rows of townships are known as townships. And the first row of townships south of the baseline is designated Township 1 South. The first horizontal row of townships north of the baseline is Township 1 North. And the farther north or south you go from the baseline, the larger that number becomes. And the line between the rows of townships is known as the town line. The north-south vertical rows of townships are called ranges. And the first range east of the meridian is Range 1 East. First range west of the meridian, logically, is Range 1 West. And again, those numbers grow larger as you progress away from the meridian. The line between ranges is called the range line. Now, we'll use some of those references during the course of our presentations today. Pittsfield Township is Township 3 South, Range 6 East. And in other words, take a look. We're 3 rows of townships. We're the 3rd row of townships south of the baseline. We're the 6th vertical row of townships east of the meridian. And that code, Township 3 South, Range 6E, can be abbreviated as T3S R6E. And we'll be coming back to that code in a few minutes. Now, Jessica, next one, the old map, please. This is a map that was developed by the Smithsonian Institution in about 1896. And it shows the land cessions that were critical to the settlement of Michigan. You can make out the horizontal, the vertical meridian in this particular map. The baseline is a little less obvious, but you can see that a number of the land cessions have a direct reference to the meridian. And the land cession that's of particular interest to us today is the one in the southeast corner, which represents the 1807 Treaty of Detroit, the land cession from the Chippewa, Ottawa, Potawatomi, and Wyandot Indians to the federal government. And it's said in some sources that the meridian follows the west boundary of the treaty, but in respect, the west treaty line follows a line that was actually established as far back as 1787. So there's a close correlation of that line from 1787, and then the Indian Treaty of Detroit in 1807, and then of course the establishment of the baseline of a meridian in 1815. Again, if you look 3 rows of townships south of the baseline and 6 ranges in from the meridian, you can identify Pittsfield Township in that map. Could I have the next slide, Jessica? Is this the oval with some big numbers in it? Okay. Here, later this afternoon, when we go out to Prairie Park to blaze and inscribe a witness tree, this is part of what will be blazed, inscribed in that particular tree. The first 2 lines, of course, range 6 and T3 will be inscribed. Now, Jack will probably not include 6, the east, it'll be R6, probably not R6E, and it'll be T1. And the reason for that, Jack tells me, is because people knew where they were in relationship to the baseline, and there was not necessary to repeat the S or the E in that particular case. But there's a third line of identifying information, the S27, and that stands for section 27. So where the 2 lines tell you what township you're in, that third line, S27, tells you where you are in the township. Could we have the township section map, please? This is a map of Pittsfield Township showing its 36 sections. If you look in the northeast corner for reference purposes, you see Washtenaw and Packard. And if you go to the northwest corner, you see part of Ann Arbor Saline Road. And of course, cutting across the southern half of Pittsfield Township is Orange Wisdom's Chicago Military Road of 1825, which today is Michigan Avenue. Now, this numbering system begins in the upper right corner and extends to the zigzags to the southeast corner. And this system of numbering is known as the boustrophic numbering system. It's a Greek term. It means to turn like an ox. And so you can certainly envision an ox pulling a plow going across the field, turning at the end, and coming back the opposite direction. And early Greek text carved in stone actually followed this particular convention. Now you can find section 27 being crossed by Orange Wisdom's Chicago Military Road and by Michigan Avenue. And we're in the northeast corner of that section. The north boundary line is Textile. The east border is Platte Road. And during the survey process, the outside boundaries were surveyed for Pittsfield Township in 1815. The internal subdivisions, these square miles, and quarters of those square miles, so you would have a southeast, southwest, northeast, northwest quadrant or so. That was surveyed in Pittsfield Township in June 1819. And That was by Joseph Wampler. And when Joseph Wampler was doing the survey, he was moving from south to north. And he would have put a corner post at the junction of Textile and Platte Road. And that corner post would have been notched on all four, squared and notched on all four sides. And on the east side of that stake, there would have been 2 notches, indicating that that post was 2 miles from the east boundary of Pittsfield Township. There would be 2 notches on the south, indicating it was 2 miles north of our south boundary, and 4 miles and 4 notches on the west and north to represent location with respect to the other 2 boundaries. And probably within 132 feet or less, there would be a witness street. Now, ironically, in going through his survey notes, there was no witness street in this section of Pittsfield Town, section 27. Obviously, there was no tree of consequent size within 132 feet, or Jack and Gil will explain about chains and things like this, but they were surveying with half chains. A full chain was 66 feet, half chains were 33, and they would normally not blaze and inscribe a witness tree that was farther away from the corner post than 132 feet. But the tree that we're simulating in Prairie Park will be blazed and inscribed facing the post. And so this is the way the locations of within a township or even in a boundary line or so were identified. Those witness trees were blazed and faced the point of the post, which in itself then was notched in various ways to identify its location within a unit. I'd like to take a few minutes and provide the historical context for the survey that Jack and Gil will discuss. And to do that, I take you back to 1774, to the first shots that were fired at Lexington and Concord with the onset of the American Revolution. And of course, in 1775, we have the Declaration of Independence. And with the Declaration of Independence, the colonies viewed themselves no longer as colonies of Britain, but as independent states. But they recognized, in order to prosecute a war against a major world power, they needed to unify and have a unified front. They needed to have some type of a federation so they could negotiate contracts, negotiate treaties, engage in diplomatic relations, to seek loans, and to certainly govern the interrelationship of the 13 states. And in 1776, the Second Continental Congress provided a framework which was known as the Articles of Confederation, and that was submitted to the 13 states for ratification. But several of the states, and particularly Maryland, had very grave reservations about signing it unless a major concern that they had was resolved ahead of time. Jessica, the map here, please. This map illustrates the concern that Maryland and several other states had. Half the colonies, about half the colonies, through grant or charter, had received western lands. Maryland had none. But to the south was the behemoth Virginia, which according to the Second Virginia Charter of 1609, had been given a swath of land that ran 400 miles north to south along the Atlantic seacoast, and they're from west and to the northwest, including, of course, up through the Great Lakes. And you see a swath of land, and so that two swaths, one that was a claim that Massachusetts had, and one that Connecticut had. In fact, where we're sitting at the present time had once been claimed by the colony and state of Virginia and the colony and state of Massachusetts. Virginia relented and transferred its land ownership to the land north of the Ohio River to the federal government. It did not release its claims to the land south of the Ohio River. And in due course, Massachusetts and Connecticut and other claims west of the Appalachian Mountains were likewise transferred. And as a result, Maryland and other states acceded to the Articles of Confederation. It was under the Articles of Confederation then that the war was brought to a close and the Treaty of Paris in 1783 was signed. But it didn't take, celebration was short. We discovered that we had a huge financial debt. The debt was between $50 and $60 million, a huge amount at that particular time. The Articles of Confederation was a very weak document, provided no executive, because obviously colonies seeking separation from a king of England wasn't going to run the risk of having a king in North America, and they had no taxing authority. And so the federal government had no way of being able to repay this, and the states themselves were not willing to come up with the funds to do so. But Thomas Jefferson and others saw a solution, and a very appealing one, and that was the sale of Western land. So in 1784, 1 year after the treaty, Thomas Jefferson and 4 other individuals drafted an ordinance that proposed the sale of Western land and the establishment of states, territories, and then states in that land. Thomas Jefferson at the time envisioned 10 territories and states in the area, and that they be admitted to the Union with full and equal rights, that they have equal responsibilities, their share of the burden of the national debt, and they could not separate from the Union after admitted. And Thomas Jefferson added a clause that said there should be no slavery in the newly established areas. The southern slave states would not accede to this, and so that clause was removed, and the ordinance passed. The next year came a very important document, the Land Ordinance of 1785. And it was that document that defined the methodology for surveying the Northwest Territory. It called for, again, east-west lines to be crossed by north-south lines at right angles, and establishment of a rectangular survey system. It defined for surveyors what they were supposed to look for and record as they were engaged in the surveying process. It, among other things, it set aside section 16 in each township as a school system, a school section. And so it's as early as 1785, there was already considerable consideration and sympathy given to the need for education in our new townships. 2 years later, of course, we had a new frame of government proposed, the Constitution of the United States, but also the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. Jessica, the next slide, please. The ordinance of the Northwest Ordinance of 1787 called for the establishment of not less than 3 territories and states, and not more than 5 territories and states. And you can see the north-south lines that were identified as being the boundaries of the not less than 3 states. But you also see a dotted horizontal line that called for this the division of those north-south areas by an east-west line that extended from the base of Lake Michigan. Now, it is that rubric that was eventually adopted. You can see that that north-south line formed the west boundary of Ohio, but then extending all the way farther north, it was expected that only 3 states or territories, that Ohio would be part of that eastern part of Michigan. And in fact, for a while, that was part of Ohio territory. So it formed a very logical division. It was a division that was used historically. And so as we move toward the Treaty of 1807, you can see why there was consideration of starting at the northwest corner of then Ohio, which followed that particular line and just extending that line, and the treaty description north along that particular line. The ordinance of 1787 also stated that no properties could be sold until first they had been ceded by the native peoples, and second they had been surveyed. And so that brings us to Jack's presentation, the surveying of the Northwest Ordinance and Michigan. And Jack comes today to us in the persona of Alexander Holmes. Alexander Holmes was, you'll learn more about him in Jack's remarks, but he was the deputy surveyor that had the most profound impact on Pittsfield Township. So please welcome Jack Owens, also known as Alexander Holmes. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Ed spent a lot of time looking for all this information, and I've done a lot. And so one thing that happens is you get so much in your head you pull out the wrong information. So I'm portraying Joseph Wampler, who was the surveyor of Pittsfield Township. Alexander Holmes figured prominently in the surveys in this area too. I just wanted to clarify that. We're here at the Township Hall, and we'll get started. I'm standing on this side, so can anybody hear me? Fine?
No. Is there any way you can use the
Okay,
podium?
I told this device likes the left side of the screen. Okay, now can you hear?
Yes.
Okay, so by 1807, when things were starting to develop in Michigan, there had already been 8 principal meridians established. And 4 of them were in the Northwest Territories, in Ohio and Indiana, Illinois. And 4 of them were down in the southern, along the Gulf area. That was developing too. So after that, they really didn't start anymore. And a big part of that was the War of 1812. When you're at war, you can't do all the other things you want. So after the war ended in 1815, there's a lot of pressure for people wanting to settle on the public land because they were all called public lands. They all belonged to everybody, in their entirety, to all of the population. But they were made available for settlement. And the 3 that were established in 1815 were all established within 6 weeks of each other. The Michigan Meridian, the 5th principal meridian, started down in the Missouri Territory, down between Arkansas and Missouri now. And the 4th one was in Northwest Illinois, or the 3rd one. And generally the meridians have names. There's only about 6, I think, that are numbered. There are 38, so all the rest are given names. And then later, after I'm finished, Gill will go ahead and talk about the experiences the surveyors had in some of their camp life and how they equip themselves. All right, just briefly, Ed talked about things started in Ohio. That was the first state formed out of the Northwest Territory. And you can see they had a whole number of systems. That's where the system was really developed by experimentation. You can see they have a great many areas done differently. Some are with our system where you have a north-south meridian crossed by a baseline, and you have an initial point. Some of them numbered from the rivers, which was really an awkward system because the first area in southeast Ohio, that dark area over in the southeast area, on the left side of it, you had Town 1 South starting at the river, whereas this doesn't want to work there. No, there it is. Whereas when they were trying to, in this area, the township 1 north is way up there, and on the other end is way down south, so it was kind of a confusing system, even though you were using township and were repeating township. The other thing Ed talked about was the survey pattern, and the townships were all laid out and numbered, but then they started, every township had the same numbering system Ed talked about, the back and forth system, and they all started down in the southeast corner. And they would go north, like he said. They go north a mile and then east a mile on a random line. Then they would come back and correct a true line and go north all the way, doing all those square miles. They'd move over 1 mile west and do the whole system again. They just keep moving across from south to north and east to west. On the north end and the west end, they did not have to meet the corners that were already there. The township lines were surveyed first, so there were mile corners every mile to start with. They would just, on the north, they would go north and intersect and just set a corner and measure over to the existing one. And they did the same thing on the west line. Okay, a little more background. 1807, the Surveyor General was Jared Mansfield, and he started coming up with a plan, which you can see on the map on the right. He's the one that came up with a system of having a north-south line intersected by east-west line, so all the Town 1 norths were at the same latitude level. All the range ones were, always east of the meridian. So he was a much more orderly person. He became a mathematics professor at West Point when it opened in 1802. And he took a leave from there, and he took the job as Surveyor General. So he had this pattern already in mind in 1807. And I'll just point out one thing. And that's well, I won't touch the thing, but you can see the baseline coming across, and there's Detroit over there. And you can see they wanted Detroit south of the baseline. I don't know why that was so important to them, but even 1807, they'd already made that determination. The other thing that happened in Michigan in that period that offers some insight to what they did is 1805, Detroit burned down. The whole city just totally gone. They had very narrow streets, and the fire just swept across the streets. So they came up with a plan to rebuild in 1805, and they started down at Woodward and laid out. They had a pattern to lay out the street, the new city layout with lines angling out, like Woodward and Grafton. All those were came up with at that time. Now, at that time, Judge Woodward went out and actually picked the location to start it. I think it was slightly east of the fort and where everything had burned down. So he established a stone there, and he took the latitude and longitude at that point. And that stone's still there today. They recovered it in, well, 2005. And if you go down there on Campus Martis in Woodward, there's a manhole covered with glass. So you can see down and see that stone. So they laid out Detroit from that one, but he also took, got the latitude and longitude. Now the way they would do that is you would use an instrument like a sextant to measure a vertical angle of the sun, and you could get latitude. The longitude was much more difficult. You had to have accurate time. The only way, the reference that they had for accurate time was Galileo discovered the 4 Galilean moons of Jupiter in 1610. And he started observing, he noticed they were quite regular. So over the next couple centuries, they kept track of those, and they developed formulas to predict one event that happened with the 4 moons. As they went around, they would go into an eclipse. So if you had a telescope, you could see the eclipse events. So they gave the times at Greenwich for the start of the eclipse or the end. They always call it first spec or last spec. Well, they published that in a table. So if you're looking at the moon and you're watching and it goes into eclipse, you look at the table and it tells you Greenwich time. So all you had to do was get your local time, and the difference in time you could convert into longitude. So there's 15 degrees of longitude for every hour. So they knew that. So he came up with latitude and longitude. And we'll see what came of that a little bit later. Okay, well, the one thing that was going on that stopped the survey efforts was Detroit was settled by the French in 1701. So the new settlers that come, they would grant lands to people. And the only easy means of transportation was along the river. So they gave out long, narrow bands of land to landowners to establish farms. And so by 1805 or 1807, that was the land ownership pattern along the Detroit River. It was all private land. The only thing was the records had all burned. And furthermore, they usually weren't surveyed. They were just given how much width they had along the river. So that was private land. The British honored title when they took over, and when it became part of the United States, we honored this private title. So they had to find out where they were, because the public lands were outside the private land. So the first thing they did was survey all these private lands. Now it was from 1807 to 1808. And they're all done by a surveyor called Aaron Greeley. And that's still the pattern, that really influenced the pattern of streets in Detroit, that ownership. If you go to Quebec sometime, you see the same pattern there, only the farms still all exist. If you go along the St. Lawrence River, you can see all the narrow farms running back from the river. So in 1810, Aaron Greeley drew his map of all the private claims he's surveyed. So this map came in existence in 1810. Well, you'll notice that there are lines going outside of it. These are township lines, base lines on there. And I probably looked at this map at least 100 times, if not more. And it wasn't until this year I realized that the map was made in 1810, those lines were surveyed in 1817. So they had to be added to the map afterwards. And you can see the area that's downtown Detroit where they first did their survey, and is right down in here. And you can see, since this is a township, there's 6 miles. It looks like it's about 8 miles north of that point of origin, Detroit, where that stone is. So that might be why there's this, there's a so-called fact that the baseline was established 8 miles north of Detroit. It really wasn't. It's just a coincidence that it's 8 miles, and it's very close. It's within 200 feet of being exactly 8 miles. But I think that's where that so-called fact came from. There's no literature in 1815 specifically saying we're going to make it 8 miles north of Detroit. Mansfield map only said it would be north of Detroit for whatever reason. The second thing they had to deal with was to get title from the Indians. They followed the British policy. They claimed they were the sovereign. They controlled the whole area. But to develop any specific area, they had to get a specific treaty from the Indians. So the 1807 Treaty of Detroit is what actually opened the area up so that it could be surveyed and could be settled. So the Indians would give up these treaties, but by 1815 they'd had 30 years experience in Ohio of having all those surveys done, and they weren't stupid. They knew that you had made a treaty, the surveyors came, and then the settlers swarmed in and took over the area. And they were trying to slow that down, but they just they just took over the whole area. And the reason they swarmed in is anybody could get a piece of public land by homesteading. They could work the land and get sweat equity, and you would get title. But there are very few areas in the world where an average person can get title to land. And that was such a magnet that it was something the Indians could never stop. They did side with the British in the War of 1812 for the, and I'm sure it was, they were hoping the British would win and stop all this settlement that was coming in. The other thing is, like I said, they knew when the surveyor showed up that, things were going to happen. So they, in 1815, when they were supposed to go out and start the survey, they wouldn't let them survey. Benjamin Huff and Alexander Holmes were the contracted to do the first work, and they prevented them from doing the work. They got their contracts in April, but they didn't start until September. And the other thing I think is they said, well, we don't agree with your interpretation of the treaty. We've got our own interpretation. And I don't know if that's true, but it was a good delaying contract, because if you got a treaty and both sides aren't sure of the terms, nothing happens. So, all right, so I'm in 1815, the war was over, and Edward Tiffin was the Surveyor General of the Northwest Territories. So he was contracted with Benjamin Huff, an Ohio surveyor, to survey the meridian, the north-south line, and Alexander Holmes, another Ohio surveyor, to do the baseline. And they were going to lay off what they called military mounting land. It was an area that was 12 townships north and south, and by 8 townships east and west. So there are 96 townships that they had to do. And they were supposed to make all the boundary lines for the 96 townships by the end of the year. And the Indians wouldn't let them survey it, so they were going to survey 2 million acres in 7 or 8 months. But they didn't do anything because the Indians wouldn't let them. The other thing that happened at that time was Edward Tiffin, he was a good administrator. He'd been the first governor of Ohio, and he'd been in charge of their constitutional convention. So So he was 100% Ohio. So, and Michigan, the territory, and the state of Ohio were already arguing over the boundary. And Ohio said Toledo's in Ohio. And even though the line might supposed to go straight east from the south end of Lake Michigan, if it didn't, we want the line adjusted. So one of the things he did is when Huff came up, he also had a contract to survey roads from Fort Meigs, which is now Perrysburg, over to the Cleveland area north of Detroit. So he told them, take our section and get the latitude at the north side of Maumee Bay, because he was interested in preserving Ohio's claim to their boundary. So Huff went up there and did that earlier in the year. In May, he made that observation. So he had a section with him. But the Indians wouldn't allow the surveys. Holmes came up to Detroit. He went to the major at the fort, Pontchartrain, and he wanted an escort, military escort. Well, the surveys were done for the Treasury Department, and of course the military was in the War Department. So he expected one department to help the other. But the major said, it's not going to happen. He said, I do not have any orders from the War Department to, send you an armed escort. And he showed him his contract, and he said, well, you might have a contract, but I'm not going to do that. It'll just invite an Indian attack. So they kept expecting everything to get settled. Their letter said this will be settled soon. Well, soon was the middle of September. And so they finally got things straightened out with the Indians. They had approved the survey, but they were still worried. So Tiffin made a couple decisions. One was he's running out of time. He's got to survey 2 million acres in 3 months. So we're going to start the meridian, because they hadn't decided where it was. We're going to make it the west side of the boundary of the Indian Treaty of Detroit, but it had never been surveyed, so he was going to survey. So they sent all the surveyors, about at least 4 crews, and maybe 6, to Fort Defiance, Ohio, with the idea if they're all together, maybe they won't have any trouble with the Indians. And actually, they never saw any Indians. There was no report they ever saw them. So the 2 decisions he made that had big effect was, one was that he would use that treaty line. The other was they would not correct for declination. So all the surveyors went to Fort Defiance, and when he got there, Huff observed Polaris to determine true north. The compass always pointed to magnetic north, so they had to determine what they called the declination. That's the angle between true north and magnetic north, and it varies wherever you are, and it changes over time. So he made an observation on Polaris to do that. He determined there was 4 degrees, the magnetic north was 4 degrees, 39 minutes east of true north, so he could make that adjustment on his compass. And what it did is it corrected so the compass vane sighted due north, but the compass needle was oriented to magnetic north. And that was to have a big effect. So they started out from Ohio, and Huff laid off the boundary. The first 42 miles, they got up to what this was called the military boundary line, which was the town 6 south in their system. But the other thing he did before they left is he must have made an observation for latitude at that point. And since Holmes and possibly Huff were in Detroit a good deal of summer, they had to obtain the latitude that Judge Woodward had at the point of origin in Detroit. So with 2 latitudes, you can get the difference in latitude. And I have a figure I got off of Google Earth. And you convert that to seconds. But you can see it's over 3,700 seconds, but they knew at that time, 1 mile was equal to 52 arc seconds of latitude. So he divided 52 into that figure, and he came up with a little over 72 miles. So he knew Detroit was 72 miles north of Fort Defiance. That was the only information he had, because they never could do their survey in the summer. So he added 6 miles, and which would give you 78 miles. That was 13 townships. So when he started his survey at Fort Defiance going north, he said, I'm at town 13 south. So from the get-go, he was going to measure 78 miles. Okay, so he was supposed to go up 78 miles, set the initial point, at which point Alexander Holmes would measure east and do the baseline. But when he got up to 6 townships south of the baseline, he deviated from his contract. He started going east, laying out townships. He told Holmes, you go measure the next 36 miles because you need the baseline. So he measured up, he started measuring up on the meridian. He got up within 2 townships, 12 miles south. He went a little farther and ran into a big river that was at flood stage. That was a year of a lot of flooding. And he said, well, I can't go this way. So he went back down to the south line of town, 2 south, and he started measuring east. And so he measured across 8 townships over to the military boundary line. And in doing so, he measured the north line of the Pittsfield Township. That was the first one. So he also was deviating from his contract. And that happened a lot in this, at this time. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about how they performed their field work. And then we'll get into the different townships they actually measured. Tiffin issued a set of instructions in 1815 that was detailed, told them how to survey, how to lay out everything, how to keep notes. And that was the first time in 30 years that anybody had written this information down. They were using it, but he's the one that codified it. The equipment they used, which we have the example back in a table, is they measured direction with a compass, and they measured their distance in chains. Well, anyway, a crew consisted of 2 chainmen, an instrument man, 2 axemen, and at that time they had packers who would bring supplies for them because they were out in the woods. They'd have to bring them from Detroit for their work here. And they had, in the summer, they had stocked some of their supplies over in Detroit while they were staying around waiting for the settle the issue with the Indians. So they had to, the instrument man would give them line, and the axeman had clear a line they could see, and probably 3-4 foot wide. And they would blaze tree. They'd cut off some bark on each side. Big trees they never cut down. It's too much time. So they would just double notch a line tree. So you knew it was on line. And literally they just picked the compass up. And if they came up to a tree and hit this edge, they'd go around on this edge and keep going. That was the level of accuracy they worked with. This was not a highly accurate system, but you know, it was a fast system. And the other thing is they were required to keep their notes. Originally they weren't, but his instructions said you'll, you know, keep all your notes in a notebook. So they had a leather notebook. Now I've got two pictures up here. One is a diagram of how he obtained north by sighting Polaris. And the other picture, I took a vacation this summer. I was up in Ketchikan, and this guy had this photograph. It's a time exposure pointing at the North Pole. So he left his camera open for about 5 hours. And what you see is all the stars rotate around the pole. And that's a good demonstration. So when he was surveying, what they did is they'd prop up a stick about 20 feet long, they'd hang a string on it and tie a big rock on it, put that in a bucket of water so the wind wouldn't blow it around, and then he'd use the compass, he'd sight Polaris, and they'd watch it. You know, Polaris is going not quite at the North Pole, it's going around a little circle. So when you get as far east as you're going, that's called eastern elongation. Or on this side, it's called western elongation. So they would watch the star, and when it stopped moving, it looked like for a short time it was going straight up the string. They would take a candle out and mark that on the ground. And then in the morning they could, and they'd leave a candle where they were. They'd go out in the morning and they could figure out how far it was over the angle over to due north. There's 2 times a year when you can do it. The stars are such that you can see elongation both morning and first thing in the evening and first thing in the morning. So if you get both positions, all you got to do is measure between them halfway, and that's due north. Then they could make the adjustment on their compass. When it came to line off the lines, they had to measure their distances, so they used the half chain that Ed talked about, which we've got some back on the table there, and they would measure 40 chains, and that's a half a mile. There's 80 chains in a mile. They're related to feet. A chain is 66 feet. So if you multiply 80 times 66, you'll find out you get 5,280 feet. So they measure 40 chains, set the quarter post, and measure 80, they'd set the section corner like Ed said. They'd square a post, drive it in, make their notches, they'd go over and blaze 2 trees, take the bark off, and scribe the range numbers, you know. And these 2 pictures, the top ones are of a surveyor's compass, and this shows the needle, but this shows with the vernier, the little device that allowed them to turn the compass box so they could get it over magnetic north and at the same time have that sight vane sighting due north. This is a stake recovered 2 years ago. It was set in 1850, happened to be in a swamp. So the reason I have it is you can see if stakes in water, it never decays. You know, you can see every axe mark on that stake, just like it was set yesterday. When they're out in the field, you know, a wood stake decays, you know, you end up with a organic stain in the soil. And then they scribe them. Here's the 2 scribes. We're going to use those today. And like Ed said, they would put the township, the range, and the section number on there. In this area, they always did the range first. This happens to be from a bearing tree from Alaska, set about 100 years ago. And by that time, they changed the convention. The other thing down in the lower left I talked about the field books they had to make up. They usually made their own. And that's the first two pages of Huff's survey notes for laying out the meridian, starting at Fort Defiance. Those are the notes for his first mile of work. So I might want to see example what they look at. The field books all vary because most of them were made up by the deputy surveyor. Okay, these images are to show you the result of not correcting for declination. If you corrected for it, the lines were pretty much north and south, east and west. But they didn't do that because I think Tiffin thought they'd save time. So this is from Google Earth image. If you go to Google Earth Pro, download that, that's free. There's a little button in there you can turn on, it'll show all the townships. So what I want you to see here is this is the first 4 townships going east, and this is the next 4 over to Haggerty Road. So Pittsfield's right in here, and then there's the east of there, the next 4 townships. You can see the lines start out, the top of the image is east and west, or the bottom, and the right and left are north. And you can see, because they weren't correcting, the lines just started drifting north. And so by the time they got over here, they're a couple degrees off. But it's very obvious that that wasn't the best decision Tiffin ever made. This is another way I was looking at it. The NOAA website has something called the National Geodetic Survey Toolkit. So I went into Google Earth and I got the latitude and longitude of each of the township corners on Town 2 South. The first line surveyed by Alexander Holmes, and allows you to calculate the bearing and the distance across there. And you can see, okay, if he's going due east, this azimuth, that's another way of measuring angles. You measure a full 360 degrees instead of having quadrants. But, you know, these should all read 90 degrees. And you can see they started out 8903. By the time he was 8 townships south, he was up to 88 degrees. He had already gotten offline. And one thing that White, who investigated a lot of this, to write a book about the initial points, he said that Holmes' work, he didn't supervise his chainmen close enough, so he made a lot of errors. You could see that looking on a map. So if you go 6 miles, you've got 480 chains, and you can see this one's 470, so he had a miscount. The next one's 490, he's got a miscount. He gets over in here and he's 485, so he's 5 chains long. So he's definitely making errors. I also was trying to come up with a way to calculate what the bearing should be if he didn't correct his azimuth. And using their toolkit, I did calculate them. The only thing is, they say their method of determining declination back in 1815, they don't have enough data. So their data, the results are, they don't say they're any more accurate than half a degree. But still, by doing that, I got mostly within the same or a quarter degree. So I think my theory is right, but I'm going to check that out more. But I could pretty well predict the azimuth that I found they actually make. Okay, so Holmes is up doing his survey, and he got up to Town 2 South and up here, and he went up and ran into the Portage Creek. There was a flood stage, so he came back and he went all the way across. So that was another deviation from their contract. So then he and his brother, he had an assistant. They were always allowed to have an assistant at that time. And the effect of having an assistant is you had 2 crews. So you could survey twice as much area in the same time as if you were just working with 1 crew. So he and his brother, they got over here to the end of the bounty land. And they measured 2 townships north, so they were finally at the baseline. That's where he's supposed to be. So what do you think he did next? He went east on the baseline and sent his brother west, right? No. They went north for 6 townships, because he was supposed to survey all these too. So they go north, 6 townships, 36 miles. They measure south, 36 miles. So by then they'd gone 72 miles. And their level of accuracy at that time was not great. They weren't expected to be. In fact, the Surveyor General 1840 told one Surveyor, John Mullet, he said it could hardly be expected that the other surveyors, Chainman and yours, will agree. You know, you just couldn't do it at the level of accuracy they measured. So they measured all the way around. They got back down here. Then finally, late November, Holmes started measuring east, doing the baseline. Well, they'd already came up here and set this point on supposedly the baseline, but they went up and around. So when he started here and went back, he was about 100 feet south of what he got for measuring 2 townships north. It just shows you that he was accumulating a little error for each township. So he laid out the baseline. He got out here on November 18th, and he said, right in his field notes, he says, "We've been waiting in water for 3 days. I quit and went back to Detroit." So, and if you go out there on 8 Mile, you know, you can't imagine there was water laying around. But, you know, he was there, I wasn't. So then he came back about 9 days later, and he surveyed down in here, and that's when he did the boundaries of Pittsfield Township. And then on the 18th of December, he went back to Ohio, and he never came back to Michigan. I guess he'd had enough of Michigan. Then at the same time, Holmes was over here. The solid lines are all the lines that Alexander Holmes measured. Hoff are all the dotted lines. So he went out here and to do his work, and he started doing these townships. So within a couple of weeks, he got up to here, and he was missing Holmes corners by 5 chains. So again, one of them was making errors. But that, I mean, it sounds terrible, but we'll discuss that later on. It's not as bad as it sounds. So if you measured up and hit a line that was already there, whether you said it was 5 chains off or not, that's as far as you were going. You hit the line, okay? So, okay. By the middle of October, he was up in here, as I said, but then he got sick, so late in October, he went back to Ohio. And he hadn't completed all his work. Holmes did most of his. Technically, they were supposed to each do half of the township. But either early January or in February, Huff came back and he surveyed north of these lines and he put in the township boundaries. He ran this baseline here because they'd never, Holmes hadn't done this stretch. And he actually set the initial point at the intersection out there. But then he went back, that's as much as he did. He quit. Another fellow named Fletcher, apparently he sublet him the contract to Fletcher. He did some of the lines. Then Fletcher reran some of the baseline, but his work was later rejected. Apparently the line through the woods they cut, they never moved that. It's just their measurements didn't all agree. So by 1821, the baseline and the meridian were set. Had been set the first time. So then they couldn't go west of the meridian, but in 1819 they had the Saginaw Treaty, which was the next one north of the Treaty of Detroit, and that went west of the baseline, or west of the meridian. So they made a contract with Joseph Wampler, who by that time had already surveyed this township, divided it into 36 square miles. So they contracted with him to do townships to the west, but again, he was to rerun the baseline in the north part of the meridian. But his contract said you will run west from Mr. Holmes' corners. They were already there. Okay. So he was supposed to use those, and he did that. But when he got up to town 2 south, he changed his contract. For whatever reason, he decided he was going to remeasure that 12 miles, but he had already run the meridian, or the baseline out. So he measured north 2 townships, and he set a initial point for the baseline going west. And he knew he wasn't at the baseline going east because he'd set that already. So he measured north, and he ended up going another 14 chains or so to intersect the baseline he'd run a month before. So we've got 2 initial points, and they're 935 feet apart. And last week we were out there and saw those points. Now the only thing I was going to talk about was chaining itself. In chaining, they used half a chain because they were worried about them measuring on hilly ground. They wanted level chaining because you always measure level in surveying. It's the only way you can repeat your measurements. So the standard practice was you would measure 1 increment at a time, 1 half chain, you just keep moving ahead. You had 11 pins, the rear chainman had 1, the head chainman had 10. So they measure out a length, the head chainman puts in the pin, they move ahead and stop. The rear chain at that point, they put a new pin, the rear chainman picks the pin up, and they go like that, and they got 10. So once they've done 10, they call that a tally. And that's 5 chains, a tally. And remember some of those errors I talked about were 5 chains? So they're obviously, some of them were miscounting the tallies, even though they had a system for keeping track of that. So you just measured that incremental process. And then when, and this is 2 chain, this is a drawing from 1745, and it shows that that's the process they went through. You'd have the compass man and directing their direction, and they were making the measurement. And then after they'd gone 10 chains, the rear chainman had 10, so he'd become the head chainman. And they'd just keep alternating until they'd gone, their half mile. Under this system, they had to go 8 tallies to go a half a mile. So they had to keep track of that count. All right, so the thing I'm going to end up with is, so we end up with 2 initial points, and we're the only state that has that honor of having 2 because we screwed up. But it doesn't cause a problem because the baseline to the east is your reference line for township. So east of the meridian, you're only counting from the baseline east. If you go west, you got a baseline jogs down, but you're counting from that baseline if you're west. So it doesn't cause any problems, really. And as I alluded to, they did make mistakes, but by 1805, 20 years after the system started, they were already arguing, well, I got a surveyor and he says you're wrong. And Congress said we can't have that. So they passed a law that said the corners that are set, and once the Surveyor General accepts the survey, that's it. Corner is a corner, irregardless of the notes. If it's wrong or not, it's right. It has no error because it's the original corner. So, and the idea was the settlers would go out and look for these posts. You know, what else were they going to go by? They didn't have the capacity to measure. So, and that's really a real strong precedent in case law. The monument marks the survey. You can have a nice map that the map shows your intent. You know, we've got pictures of the township map, and that's the intent of the survey. But the monument is the post in the ground. That's the location. You're there. So, and that's why today when we go out and survey, Gill and I, or anybody other surveyor, you have to use those corners because that was the original corner for the section. We don't have any authority to move anybody's existing property lines. We're supposed to retrace it and find it. And even though they've been neglected, the only effect that has on you is you'll have to pay us more because it takes more time. All right. And this is I'll let you read this. I found this. It's interesting. This guy wrote, I got to get his book and read it, but he it's a good perception of the surveyor.
I ask you a question, please?
Yes.
Some of the townships have lost property due to annexation. Does everybody keep track of these?
Well, okay, now we're talking about two things here when you say township. Well, I didn't bring it up, but what we're talking about is a survey township. They're all, if they're full townships, they're all 6 miles square, 36. And politically, there's a township level of government. That's a political thing. That's set up by law. And most of the time, like here, the survey township, the political township coincide. Now you get up north, you probably don't remember in detail Dad's map, but you get up in UP, and a township political is 4 or 5 of these townships. Occasionally, like Northville and Plymouth Township, they're each half of a survey township. So it sounds like your question is about the political township functioning. When you're talking about losing ground, you're really saying what's called, you know, Northville Township lost some land to Northville City. Right? That's a kind of, yeah, well, that's a political issue, not a survey issue. But they involve the same piece of ground.
Thank you very much, Jack.
Yeah.
Jack is really a very knowledgeable historian. I was going to take a few minutes and trace the route of the surveyors to Pittsfield Township. I'll just summarize that very, very quickly. Jessica, do you have my map there?
Yeah.
Jack mentioned the problems that the surveyors had as Alexander Holmes was coming north along the meridian with his intent to get up to the baseline. He couldn't because of the Portage River, which was in flood stage. He came down and he was surveying then the line between townships 2 and 3 south. That's Pittsfield Township's northern boundary. And he reached E on this map, which is our northwest corner, on the afternoon, late afternoon on October the 17th. And He set the post that marks the township boundaries, conjunctions of Pittsfield, Lodi, Scioto, and Ann Arbor townships. And then he continued on east another 4 miles, and he set the 4th mile corner post in at what today is Washtenaw and Platte Road. Glenwood Road is on the north side of Washtenaw. And this is about a quarter of a mile east of Heron Parkway. And he spent the night there. And the next day, on the 18th, he surveyed 2 miles to the east, setting our northeast corner post. And that is what we're celebrating today, the establishment of that northeast corner post, which was set 100 years ago today. However, he set it about 10 o'clock. Our program began at 2, and by the time our program began 200 years ago, he'd already advanced another 4 miles, surveying the boundary between Ypsilanti and Superior Township. Now that day, as Jack pointed out, they continued all the way to the east edge of the military bounty land. That was 14 miles in one day, in inclement conditions. The weather was unusually cold. We were still in the last grips of the little ice age. We had the Tambora, maybe Gil will talk about this, the volcano Tambora erupted in Indonesia, what today is Indonesia. And it spread so much ash and soot into the atmosphere that it cooled Earth. And the next day, next year in 1816, it was known as the year without summer. Water froze in the streets of New York. So they were working in these kinds of conditions, and yet they went 14 miles. And if you stop and think what they did in that one day, it's mind-boggling. They had to clear a sight line for pulling, for a compass sight line and for pulling chain. They, as Jack pointed out, they put a pin, pulled a half chain, which was 33 feet, marked another pin, pulled the chain again. They had to do that 2,240 times on that day. They had to cut 28 corner posts, square the tops, notch them to indicate their location, dig 28 holes, bury those posts, making sure they pointed the right directions. They had to blaze 56 witness streets. And they had to all the time make sure that their line was running straight, and Alexander Holmes had to make survey notes and to record observations such as Indian pathways or so. It was truly a mind-boggling day. And for that day, Alexander Holmes was paid $49, which he had to share with all his crewmen, and had to, with which he had to buy all the supplies and everything else. And with that very, very brief comment, my wife and I have prepared a map of this map. We put it on foam core, and we were very fortunate to have Alan Squire of Pittsfield Township, GIS, create this particular map, so it's an electronic form at this point in time. And part of this is reflected on the format, which is behind us here. But with that, I'd like to turn it over to Gill Bonno, who will talk shortly about the life of a surveyor. Gill?
Thanks, Ed. I'd like to thank Ed and his wife, Mary Ellen, and the township for inviting us. This is a great honor. I mean, think 200 years ago today, surveyors were here setting Pittsfield Township corners, and we are in the situation we're in today where we have these nice modern facilities that we can sit in and listen to somebody like us talking. Anyway, a lot of what I'm going to talk about has already been spoken of. But what I'd like to do is just read some information I pulled off the line relative to the conditions that the surveyors were going through, as well as some actual words that they spoke, that they wrote down and reported back to the Surveyor General at the time relative to the conditions that they were going through. And also, has been mentioned earlier, finances, money that they were paid. At that time, they were paid $3.50 per mile for the exterior boundaries of the township. And for the interior miles that they surveyed, they were paid $2.50 a mile. That money, that $2.50 and that $3.50 was used to buy their supplies, their equipment, their food, all of the axes, pay all of the chainmen, their axemen, anybody that was on their crew to perform these surveys as they were taking place. So they had to move fast, like Ed indicated. You know, they covered a lot of ground in a short period of time. It took a lot of energy to do all of that. But anyway, the crews, they faced extraordinarily hostile wilderness. The land was blanketed with swamps and barely impenetrable forests. They encountered watercourses, swamps, and they could not follow, the trails that were established by the natives at that time. Anybody that had come into the area to already settle it, or the Indians that were there previously, obviously, they had a trail system where they were able to avoid the swamps and stay on the higher ground. But the surveyors, they had to follow that true north course, that true east-west course as they're proceeding along doing the surveys in Michigan. Conditions were very, very bad. They'd enter cedar and black ash swamps. They'd be wading in water up to their waist or whatever. Some of the comments that the early surveyors, as I indicated earlier, when they reported back to the Surveyor General at the time, Benjamin Ho, makes note on October 12th of 1815. This is Benjamin speaking. I found thus far exceeding bad ground to run lines over, being very thick of underbrush, and in many places swamps for a great distance, almost impassable. When I arrived at the military land, my provision became very short, as that of Mr. Holmes and Mr. Evans. And at a distance of 4 miles on the south lines came to an extensive lake, which was in many places bordered by swamps and almost impassable, which detained me upwards of 1 day in getting around it. Even then the swamps impeded my progress very much, but the difficulty in meandering around those lakes is beyond anything you can conceive. From what I've seen, this country is no ways inviting. It is true there's some good spots, but a large portion is either useless swamps or poor and barren. Our situation is at this time very unpleasant, having been on the short allowance of provision for 5 days, and at this time not 10 pounds of flour for 13 men, until a supply can be brought from Detroit, which will require at least 20 days. But we do not despair of surmounting the difficulty if our health is preserved, with which we have been blessed so far. So, they were probably getting pretty hungry about that time, I would imagine. Then Alexander Holmes, another deputy surveyor, later on in November of 1850, indicated we have suffered almost every hardship and encountered almost every difficulty that could be expected of mortals to endure. But amidst all have been blessed with good health. It is my intention not to quit until I finish, which I hope to accomplish before the 20th of next month. It doesn't sound like the conditions got any better. It sounds like they kind of got worse as they progressed along. I was talking with Ed earlier, and we were talking about a situation where the surveyors, as they're going down the line, and obviously setting these posts and digging these holes, and this was probably in the wintertime, ground was frozen. Surveyor was using his shovel at the time, and back then they didn't have any OSHA regulations or anything like that governing the quality of their tools. But as he was digging the hole to set the post, stepping on the side of that spade, pushing it in the ground, his foot slipped off, he went forward, and the shovel handle impaled him He laid on the ground for several hours before he finally passed away. Pretty agonizing death, so it was difficult. And another surveyor writes, and this is Robert Clark, and this is on March 31st. Anyway, he writes, first contract as a deputy surveyor, a subdivision of T4N R5 South, encountered hail, snow, rain, and wind, blew a gale all day. On March 20th, after crossing the Grand River at a 40-inch white oak at 14.8 chains west of the river on the south side of Section 31, he sat down and died on the job. So, and that was at the age of 33. So again, conditions were pretty tough. They encountered a lot of illness, sickness, and you know, again, we were lucky that we're able to talk about it today. Jack alluded to Edward Tiffin's report, and I'll kind of wrap up with what he wrote. This is in a letter dated November 30th of 1815 from Surveyor General Edward Tiffin to Joseph Meigs, Commissioner of the General Land Office. He wrote, "Sir, the surveyors who went to survey the military lands in Michigan Territory have been obliged to suspend their operations until the country shall be sufficiently frozen as to bear man and beast. I annex a description of the country which has been sent to me by Benjamin Hull, and who I informed all the surveyors concur in. I think it my duty to give you this information, believing that it is the wish of the government that the soldiers should have, as the Act of Congress expresses, lands fit for cultivation, and that the whole of the 2 million acres portioned in the territory of Michigan will not contain anything like 1/100th part of that quantity, or it is worth the expense of surveying it. Perhaps you think with me that it will be proper to make this representation to the President of the United States, and he may avert all further proceedings." And this is a description. "The country on the Indian boundary line from the mouth of the Great Auglaize River, that is the line established by the Treaty of Detroit in 1807, and identical or nearly so with the principal meridian of the government surveys, and running thence for about 50 miles is, and with some few exceptions, low, wet land with a very thick growth of underbrush intermixed with very bad marshes, but generally very heavily timbered with beech, cottonwood, oak, etc. Thence continuing north and extending from the Indian boundary eastward, the number and extent of the swamps increases, with the addition of the number of lakes from 20 chains to 2 and 3 miles across. Many of these lakes have extensive marshes adjoining their margins, sometimes thickly covered with species of pine called tamarack, and other places covered with a coarse high grass, and uniformly covered from 6 inches to 3 feet or more at times with water. The margins of these lakes are not the only places where swamps are found, for they are interspersed throughout the whole country and filled with water, as above stated, and varying in extent. The intermediate space between these swamps and lakes, which is probably near 1/2 of the country, is, and with very few exceptions, a poor, barren, sandy land on which scarcely any vegetation grows, except very small scrubby oaks. In many places, that part which may be called dry land is composed of little, short, sandy hills forming a kind of deep basin, the bottoms of many of which are composed of marsh similar to the above described. The streams are generally narrow and very deep compared with their width, shores and bottoms of which are, with very few exceptions, swampy beyond description, and it is the utmost difficulty that a place can be found over which horses may be conveyed in safety. A A circumstance peculiar to that country is exhibited in many of these marshes by their being thinly covered with a sward of grass, by walking on which evinces the existence of water or a very thin mud immediately under their covering, which sinks from 6 to 18 inches under the pressure of foot at every step, and at the very time rises before and behind the person passing over. The margins of many of the lakes and streams are in similar situation, and in many places are literally afloat. On approaching the eastern part of the military land towards private claims on the straits and lakes, the country does not contain so many swamps and lakes, but the extreme sterility and barrenness of the soil continue the same. Taking the country altogether, so far as it has been explored, and to all appearances, together with information received concerning the balance, it is so bad that there would not be more than 1 acre out of 100, if there would be 1 out of 1,000, that would be in any case admit of cultivation. End of his report. Goes on to say the result was that Congress passed a law April 29, 1816, repealing that part of the Act of 1812 that authorized the locating of military boundary lands in Michigan, and in lieu thereof provided for a survey of 1.5 million acres in Missouri. So again, the conditions that they had to go through, it was very difficult, arduous. They suffered through all kinds of mosquito infestations during the summertime. In fact, one surveyor, deputy surveyor, told his crews that to suspend their operations during the summer months, to pick it back up once it got cold, and then continue surveying, and once it started to warm up, stop your surveying as well. Go back home, start it all over again when the conditions are right. But anyway, as I mentioned earlier, we owe a debt of gratitude to the surveyors of 200 years ago who blazed the trail for us, established civilized areas, was able to set up a pattern survey that established our legal descriptions as we know them today. So with that, appreciate your time, appreciate your willingness to listen to us.
Thank you very much, Gil. This concludes our indoors program. We'll take a break for about half an hour, and then we'll go out to Prairie Park, and Jack will blaze and inscribe the witness tree. His inscription will be about 1.5 inches or so high, as opposed to what you saw on the screen here, which was really quite large and quite prominent. We have a floor mat behind you, which has signage on it that indicates who surveyed what lines, where they camped for nights, and things like that. It shows the path of the Great Salt Trail as well as the St. Joseph Trail, which paralleled Textile Road heading west. We have Mary Ellen and I have gone through the entire survey of Pittsfield Township and have transcribed it, and with Jack's help we've annotated it. And so we know how informative that document was in terms of describing the terrain, the trees, the nature and character of the community, which looked nothing like what it does today. It's hard to conceive how great the transition has been between 1815 and 1819 and today. But please know that as late as 1850 and going on 1860, there were huge areas of Pittsfield Township where it was still unusable marsh and swamp. And back here on one side wall, we have a transcription of the survey notes that relate to the Carpenter Road heading up to Morgan and over. And so there's a summary that shows the kind of abbreviated code that the surveyors used in their survey books, survey notes, and then we have an annotated version of that. And you can see that it talks about marshes where we have no concept of marshes. It talks about Indian trails, the Great Salt Trail, and things like that. Back here we do have a map of the 1856 flat map of Pittsfield Township. That was the first map that was done in Pittsfield Township following settlement, and it shows some of the marshes and swamps still intact. The original survey map done by Alexander and Samuel Holmes of the boundaries and Joseph Wampler of the subdivisions or so just saw the section lines, did not look at the interior of any of the sections. And so you'll see a dash or a wiggly line indicating a stream or a path or something like this, but we had no idea of the concept inside the section. But we have that from our, we have that in the 1856 map. So with that, we'll break for a while. The Pittsfield Township Historical Society has refreshments down the hall, in the conference room down the hall and to your left. And we'll be here for a while so you can ask Jack and Gil questions. And then we'll go out and do the blazing and inscribing of the witness tree. And thank you all very, very much for coming. And Jack and Gil, thank you so much for your expertise and sharing that with us today.